Hermvids with Mr. Herman. Educational videos about reading and writing. Hey class, this is Mr. Herman, and this video is all about poetry. The goal for this video is for you guys to figure out not only what poetry is, because you probably have a good handle on that, but also how to look at poetry in a new way, because we're going to be spending some time on it, and I want you guys to really give it your all. So, good luck everybody. Alright, so the question for this video is, what is poetry? And we're going to break this down in a few different ways. Of course, we have our poetries here in the background, and we're going to look at poetry in terms of some familiar ideas and some unfamiliar ideas. Let's get going. I cultivated a few different definitions from dictionary.com and Merriam-Webster's dictionary of what poetry is, just to give you an idea of what the experts say. Poetry is defined in a few different ways. Prose with poetic qualities, the art of rhythmical composition for beautiful or elevated thoughts, or the productions of a poet. Let's take a look at some of these examples. Prose is non-poetic writing with poetic qualities, so that's kind of confusing in itself. The art of rhythmical composition. Rhythm is when something has a beat to it, so that makes sense. For beautiful or elevated thoughts. Well, that can mean a whole lot of different things. The productions of a poet. That's even more confusing because you may consider someone a poet and someone else may not. For instance, if I asked you if Justin Bieber's lyrics were poetry, some people would say yes because they think he's a poet, and some would think no because he's not a poet, according to them. William Shakespeare is someone who people generally agree is a poet, and his work, like his sonnets, are considered poetry. So the idea behind looking at these definitions is sometimes it's difficult to tell what poetry is and what it isn't. I kind of want you to take your ideas of poetry and kind of blow them up and just have an open mind for all this, because lots of different stuff can qualify as poetry. Now let's take a look at what sometimes poems have. Sometimes poems have meter, which is a rhythmic pattern. That's a beat. We're going to get into this a little bit later, but this involves things like counting the syllables out, things like stressing words and not stressing words. Guys like Robert Frost, very famous poets, used meter to their advantage, so when their poems were read out loud, they had a nice flow to them, kind of like in modern-day rap. Some poems have rhyme, but not all poems have rhyme. Rhyme is that repeated sound at the end of a word. Sound and found rhyme. There's that ound sound that is repeated. Then there's just repetition in general, like the chorus of a song. It's when you repeat words or lines for emphasis. Poetry seems to do this more than prose, regular writing. Some poetry uses figurative language, which we've learned about earlier. Similes, metaphors, hyperboles are included in this category. And some poems use imagery. Keep in mind that not all poetry has all of these things. That's what makes poems kind of difficult to figure out. So once again, let's get into our formal and informal mindset to look at poetry. Like we said before, things that are formal are things that have rules. Formal speech is speech that is supposed to be official. Formal wear is clothing that is more official, like a shirt and tie. Formal poetry is poetry that abides by specific rules. Now with poetry, these rules usually involve rhyme schemes or meter, meaning this line has to be this amount of syllables, or this line needs to rhyme with this line. Some examples you may be familiar with are sonnets, haikus, sestinas, and limericks. All of these have specific guidelines. Maybe a haiku has 5 syllables for the first line, 7 syllables for the second, and 5 for the third. Rules like that make it formal. Shakespearean sonnets are a pretty famous example of formal poetry, and you can experience them online. There's some great apps. Here's just a quick taste of what a Shakespearean sonnet's like.
More lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's lease hath all too short a date.
So that's one of the Doctor Who's David Tennant reading one of Shakespeare's famous poems, number 18. You can see here, day rhymes with May, temperate rhymes with date. sort of. And each line actually has 10 syllables. Very complicated formulas for some of these. Now, usually when we think of formal poetry, we think of things like this. Things that have these intense rhymes to them, pieces of writing that have these complicated rhythms. But not all poetry is like that. Some is, but not all of it. That's where we get to informal poetry or free poetry. They have less rules, just more of like an overall style to them. What I mean by style is maybe they have a very different form to them, like the way they look. Maybe they rely on a certain emotion to communicate their point of view. I have a few examples here. Beat poetry, which is a type of poetry that existed back in the 50s and 60s. I mean, it still exists, but not as popular. We'll get into that later. Slam poetry, which is a poetry type that kind of jumped out in like the 80s, similar to rap. And found poetry. You might have done it before where you pick random words and mix it together to make a poem. Let's take a look at the beginning of a few examples. This first one is an example from a girl who puts her slam poems online, and I'll just give you a taste of the beginning of it. It's quite good.
When I first learned that no one could ever love me more than me, a world of happiness previously unseen was discovered because somewhere along the line of aging and scrutiny and time, I was taught to despise myself. But I made sure I kept myself beautiful so someone would love me someday, so I could belong to someone someday, because that's the most important thing a little girl could ever want, right? I was 13 the first time I was embarrassed about my body. Of course, it would not be the last. And I remember stuffing my bra in the morning, tears stinging my eyes, hoping, praying to something that I could look beautiful enough today, braces and all, for the ruthless boys who mercilessly told me I was worthless because my boobs weren't big enough.
So there you go. This is a young lady who has created a very emotional example of a slam poem, and there was no rhyme to it. But there was this kind of rhythm that she used. So that's an example of this less formal poetry. Jimmy Fallon does a skit on his Tonight Show where he has these type of poems about something silly. This one's about...
Here to perform a slam poem about the 1990s sitcom Boy Meets World, Samuel L. Jackson.
Boy meets world. Boy greets world. Hello world! I'm Corey Matthews, short and average, head full of curls. The year 1993, we see two boys who lack both brains and brawn. Corey Matthews and Hunter, comma, Sean. Hair parted down the middle.
Now, if you've seen this show, Boy Meets World, it's a little bit more funny, but the idea is there is some rhyme, there is some rhythm, but it's nothing too specific. It gives you some freedom. Some people like the informal style of poetry to write in more. Some people like the formal more. We're going to experience both in this class. You can pick which one that you think you're more comfortable in. So here are some more terms that really get more in depth with what sometimes poems have. And these are terms we're going to use in this class. Terms like meter, which is the rhythm of a poem. It involves syllable counts and stressed and unstressed syllables. You might emphasize a word more in a line, and that gives it emotional emphasis. You might try to keep your lines a similar amount of syllables, or you might mismatch them to give your poem a fragmented feel. A syllable, if you don't know, is a unit of sound. You can count them out by counting your fingers on your hand. Take your name, for example. My name, Mr. Herman, that's 4 syllables. Famous types of meter are things like iambic pentameter, which were used in sonnets. That means Shakespeare would use iambic pentameter to write his poetry. They were 10 syllables per line, unstressed and then stressed syllables. So you can get as complicated as that, or you can just try to keep your poems with a smooth rhythm, with a similar amount of beats per line. You can really experiment with meter when you write. Rhyme is something some poems have, and there are these types of rhymes that can be more complicated or less complicated depending on what you're trying to accomplish. End rhymes are like your Dr. Seuss type rhymes. There once was a cat who wore a big hat. It's that last syllable that rhymes back to back, as if you're going for a more basic feeling for your rhyming. If you want to get more complicated, you do things called multi-syllable rhymes, when more than just the last two syllables rhyme. Modern-day rappers, in their lyrics, some consider it poetry, they use multiple syllable rhymes to show how complicated they are. Kanye West said, "I was the abomination of Obama's nation." That's multiple syllables, not that last shun sound, but the ones preceding it. First things first, I'm the realist. Drop this and let the whole world feel it. Realist, feel it. That's more than just one syllable there. Hopefully you get the idea. Ludacris is a rapper who uses multi-syllables in nearly all of his songs. In rhymes are examples of individual lines that have multiple words within that very line that rhymes inside it. The tall doll crawls in the great halls. That's multiple sounds within that same line that rhymes with each other. Another really common example that even Shakespeare used was something called near rhyming, when the rhyme is not completely a perfect rhyme, but sounds close enough when you say it out loud. All my people in the house about to get down. It's that ow sound. So it's not a perfect rhyme, but when you say it out loud, it sounds close enough. Near rhymes make rhyming less scary for everybody else. So don't be too afraid if you have to write a poem with rhyme in it, but not all poems have rhyme, of course. The last piece to this whole poetry puzzle, we've got some songs, or some poems have meter, some have rhyme. Form is another piece. This is how you can tell what's prose and what's poetry. Poems look different than prose. Poems usually have unique structure, stanzas instead of paragraphs, with more liberty to experiment. This is prose. It was taken from ESPN.com. It's about Carmelo Anthony and Chris Bosh and where they're planning on signing in the off-season. You can tell it's just paragraphs, sentences, commas, that whole thing. The last piece here is a poem from Charles Bukowski, who is a poet. And you can see that he has one line with a very single word on it. He doesn't capitalize. There's less punctuation going on. As a poet, you have more freedom to experiment with form. Now we're going to talk about poetry versus prose. I've been using that term prose a lot. I'm going to define it. And then finally why I think poetry is important for you guys to learn. Prose is writing that is broken down, writing in general is broken down into two categories, prose and poetry. Prose is more ordinary writing, usually matter of fact, does not usually use a rhythm. Prose can be poetic, but it's not poetry. Novels can have poetic lines or paragraphs, but that doesn't mean a novel is a poem. Textbooks, instructions, tweets, texts, they're more used for prose than poetry. Poetry is important for a number of reasons. I believe it's important because it's really a pure expression of your thoughts. There are so few words in poems that you have to boil it down to its essence, and it can really allow you to express yourself in a unique way. You don't have to worry about storytelling all the time, or even really making total sense. It's a better way to express your emotions, or a combined thought and emotion. It's like a concentrated, boiled down piece of writing where every word can pack a punch, or it's used for a specific purpose. When you're writing novels, it's difficult to make every single word mean something. But when you have poetry, you can do that. You can pick your words for a very specific purpose. Maya Angelou is an example of a poet who became very famous for doing this. Poetry is like the art of language. It's the painting of the word world. Modern lyrics can even be considered poetry themselves. So if you're a fan of music, you're probably a fan of poetry as well. It's a chance to experiment because there's so many different types of poetry that there's something for everyone. When you guys think of poetry, you may only think of a very specific type of thing, like a sonnet, for instance, or that thing you had to read in 8th grade that you hated. But poetry is so much more than that. So what I ask for you to do in this unit is just to give it a chance. Hopefully when you'll be finished with this unit, there'll be one new type of poetry that'll speak to you, and that'll open up a whole new world for you.